Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
We are a bit over 2 months into the new administration. A lot of conventional norms have already been upended. No question, we're seeing a test of the president's powers as he works to slash the size of the federal government, change immigration policy, some of which, such as birthright citizenship, is actually enshrined in the Constitution, go after critics and the media, and upend the U.S.'s relationship with not only its largest trading partners, but also some of its longtime allies. Our next guest argues that the world we find ourselves in is, quote, unruly. Sean West is the co-founder of Hens Technologies. It uses AI to help companies protect themselves from risks. He's also the former global deputy CEO of the political risk consultancy Eurasia Group. He's got a new book out. It's called Unruly, Fighting Back When Politics, AI, and Law Upend the Rules of Business. He joins us from Los Angeles. Sean, good to see you. My introduction has to do with the last couple of months, but you wrote this before you knew that the president would come into office and do what he's been doing. You argue that we've been sort of in this unruly world for quite a while. What exactly does it mean?
Well, thanks for having me on. Yeah, so I put my pencil down November 15th on this book. So I had about 10 days to update for the fact that Trump was taking over the White House and to really think through how the broader trends I was writing about were going to extend into the new administration. Now, I've been a political forecaster for nearly 20 years, so that's a normal day for me to try and think about what it really means. But you know, the book Unruly is a play on the word because unruly means disorderly. Certainly the world is volatile, but also we are witnessing a world that's been quote unquote unruling, as I call it, where the rules of globalization have been eroding, where the rule of law has become a question mark in more places than it's become a certainty. And that's not just about the Trump administration. That's been in play over the last 4 years in the United States, but it's also been in play globally. And so what I try and do in the book really is say that what's happening is it's not enough to just say that we live in a politically volatile world. We need to recognize that the law is changing and technology is changing at the same time. And those three factors changing all at once is creating a significant unruliness, a really difficult situation for investors and firms to navigate.
By the way, I'm not making a judgment call as to what has happened in the last couple of months. There are many Americans, I think it's fair to say the majority, or not the majority, but, you know, of the votes who voted, who did vote for this president and what we're actually seeing come from him. I think it's important to note, Sean, outside of the U.S., where do you think this is happening?
Well, if you look across the 74 elections that happened in 2024, we saw a number of them where it wasn't clear that the elections were free and fair. You could look at something like Venezuela and draw a conclusion about the election that happened in 2024. You can identify a number of countries. I mean, Hungary is a great example where the courts are effectively under the control of political leadership, right? And so you've had this trend and a real erosion in the rule of law. The World Justice Project has talked about how for the 7th straight year, more than half the countries in the world have seen an erosion in rule of law rather than an increase in rule of law. And so that's the backdrop against which we live in. We live in a world where the rules of the game are not clear. Think about it from an international law perspective. You know, the US or any number of other countries puts tariffs on each other. That would typically go through the WTO. And there's a little bit of going through the motions, but the idea that it's against your legal commitments is certainly not constraining political actors. We've seen this in the rules of war as well, right? I mean, Israel exploding walkie-talkies and exploding pagers may or may not be a good military tactic, may or may not be justified politically, depending on your point of view. But from the perspective of law, you're not allowed to explode civilian devices, right? So there's this concept that I'm trying to drive home in the book that the rules of globalization, where the world was sort of converging towards a single set of global values or Western values masquerading at global values, is no longer what's guiding us. We're now living in a world where countries and blocks of countries are going their own way, not just in the rules that they put in place, but in how they interpret the way they need to deal with other countries.
Is it possible that the reason there is this pushback against global values is because the rule of law doesn't work equally for everyone?
For sure. So I think, if you look at the global population, like 2/3 of the humans in the world have never had access to justice, right? And we're seeing
Right.
there's a trend. There's a trend against that, as I highlighted with this rule of law erosion. But the reality is that, of course, moneyed interests and folks who can afford the best legal advice have always done better in courts than those that can't. What I think is interesting and what I get at in the book, that's really a core thesis, is technology is coming through to change all of that. So in the book, I go through a number of different examples of where I use technology. I use AI to fight legal battles for me, where before I might not have wanted to spend the money on legal representation. I might not have had the money to spend it. I can now use AI to fight that battle. So we're going to be living in a world where citizens who have been disenfranchised or who are realizing that the rule of law is eroding also now are equipped to take the law into their own hands. And that's a particularly risky environment.
Why do it's kind of amazing. What's your take? You've certainly at Eurasia Group, consulted a lot of companies and executives. And it is interesting to see in an environment that some would say that it's like the wild, wild west all of a sudden, certainly here in the United States, where there isn't executives speaking up and saying, well, wait a minute, we are a country where rule of law means something. And why isn't there the speaking out? And I mean, I know maybe I'm asking like naively, let's get this out. But I mean, because we have seen pushback certainly from the administration, but I'm just curious, why do you think the corporate community isn't standing up and speaking?
So I think there are two reasons why they're not speaking up. Number one, most of them are scared. They're running scared, and they're also afraid if they speak up against some issues and for some issues, even the things that they're supporting that are aligned with the president may no longer be aligned with the president in a month or two. So I think there's a little bit of a fear that the policy volatility is too great to even know where your position is. But I also think we need to remember it's early days, right? We're only a couple months into this administration, and I think the corporate community had been under the assumption that Trump was bluffing about these tariffs, right? The markets were priced for a bluff, and CEOs' supply chains were designed as if the president wasn't serious. So there's a lot of digestion about how the president is serious about delivering his promises. I think when we start to see pressure on free speech through the newspapers, when we start to see pressure on the legal system, on courts, on law firms, et cetera, I think it takes time for that to filter back through to the corporate community to speak up. I would expect to see more vocal CEOs in the second and third quarter of this year because none of them signed up for a recession, right? They signed up to look away on a lot of the culture war issues that they may or may not agree with in order to get lower taxes and deregulation. They didn't sign up for a recession.
They're not necessarily looking away. They're sort of embracing some of that culture war when it comes to the anti-DEI stuff and the way that companies have really shifted how they're looking at that within their own companies.
I think they're certainly taking the opportunity to simplify their business by removing a lot of this. Many of these CEOs spoke out about how DEI was a secret weapon that would help them be more competitive. And I don't think the MBA studies that they commissioned suddenly changed between January 19th and January 21st. I think that they decided there was a political wind toward going in one direction. They had no choice. But also, I think for a lot of them, it's easier to manage a business when you're less constrained. So I agree with that. So, you're right to say it's not necessarily that they're looking away from the culture wars because they dislike them. It's that they're not interested in the culture war. They're interested in making money.
But they did look at the culture wars during George Floyd and right after the murder of George Floyd. Like they were all in. I mean, we talked to so many of them after, during COVID. I mean, they were so accessible and they did speak out. And I think a lot of it had to do with their employee base speaking out. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, look, I think it's a sea change, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody looked at it after George Floyd. They reflected on their own business practices and decided they could do better, and they said as much, and they felt pressured to do that. I think they're now going with the political wind that says that a majority of the population doesn't want to see that, and so you could ask if they were being opportunistic then and being opportunistic now. Maybe that's what you want as a shareholder in your company, to be able to maneuver with the political winds. But we're coming out of an era where there had been an emphasis on businesses articulating values, and we're certainly not hearing a lot about values. We're hearing now about value and shareholder value. So that's a reversion to the mean of the post-war era, I would say.
So it raises the question about what are businesses to do over the next couple of years. is this a permanent shift in the way business leaders is this a permanent shift in the environment and just a total fundamental upending of the liberal world order that we grew up with, that we were so used to? Or is this a blip and things go back to the way we thought they were?
This is a shift to a new normal. This is not a blip. Trump's first term was a blip. The world decided foreign countries decided to wait him out. And they didn't really engage on fighting back. We're now seeing Canada talk about how the relationship with the U.S. will never go back to normal. What we're seeing is a fundamental change in the U.S. government. I write about this in Unruly that the majority of America that voted for Donald Trump wanted a question answered about the size and the role of the U.S. government. And the administration's answering that, right? It's removing programs that took decades to build, perfect, and attract talent for, and you can't put that back together. There's no pendulum swinging back to put U.S. aid and U.S. soft power back together in 2 years if Congress flips, or in 4 years if the presidency flips. That's gone. And it's very hard to spend money in this environment on things like that. So, from my point of view, we've shifted to a new normal. It's a new normal that a majority of Americans are in support of, or believed they were in support of generally. And we'll have to see if they, like the extensions of it and the way it's manifested. That's a new environment for CEOs. That's an environment where, frankly, American CEOs are talking to foreign customers and foreign partners who are worried that the U.S. policy environment will make them not be able to fulfill their commitments, right? We typically think about emerging markets that way. Should I do business with X company from X country because the rules and laws might change? Everything is changing so fast in the U.S. U.S. companies are facing that challenge.
Well, what's interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit about the markets and how we wrapped up today and really for the week overall, we're seeing pressure certainly on equities, right? We've seen 10% corrections and so, on the major averages. And so you do wonder whether or not investors, CEOs kind of rethink this, is certainly because a lot of this is happening based on the policy out of DC. All right, Sean, thank you so much. Sean West is co-founder of Hence Technologies. He is former global deputy CEO of Eurasia Group, and his book that is out, it is entitled Unruly, Fighting Back When Politics, AI, and Law Upend the Rules of Business. Sean, thanks so much.